Joining us in studio is Christopher White. Chris's forthcoming book is Pope Leo XIV, Inside the Conclave and the Dawn of a New Papacy. Welcome back to Jesuitical, Chris.
Great to be with you both. Thanks for having me.
And I feel like listeners are probably going, wait, he already wrote a book?
Yeah, there's been some really sassy comments on Twitter about that already. Yes.
How does someone do that?
Well, so in full disclosure, the project was already sort of inked before the conclave, before Pope Francis even got sick. The idea was that whoever walked on the balcony as the next pope, I would write a book on this person. And it would sort of be the story of how that person became pope, kind of a quick portrait of who this person is, where they might be leading the church, and what the election means. And so I wrote the section on Pope Francis and his legacy. I took a first stab at that last summer and then got it ready. And again, after the synod, after some sort of, after he kind of finished up his legacy project. And then I began in fury the night that Pope Leo was elected.
That's wild.
It has been a whirlwind. It was the contract by the wonderful people at Loyola Press was that 10 days after the Pope was published, I had to have it submitted. And I did.
I mean, that's incredible. So what was your prep like? Were you preparing sort of outlines for a number of different outcomes?
Well, the prep for the book was the same prep for my job, because I had to be prepared for whoever walked out on the balcony. So I had files for about 12 guys who I thought might emerge as the next pope, basically collecting all the interviews they had ever given or as many speeches I could get my hands on. And then I had pre-written profiles of potential papabulae. And so I kind of used that as sort of the initial draft to then expand into the book. So as you can see, the book is about 160 pages, so it's meant to be quite accessible and readable to provide this sort of initial sort of portrait of who this person is, both for Catholics and non-Catholics alike.
So just to set the table here, we're talking on June 24th. Yes. So we're now just a little over a month into Pope Leo's papacy, and he hasn't made any huge decisions at this point. So if we were going to talk about what he's done so far, it would basically be dissecting a bunch of speeches to different heads, or meetings with heads of state, speeches to different constituent groups, jubilee events. So we don't want to focus so much on that, more on the lead up to Pope Leo's election. But before we get to that, you have a lot going on in your life right now. You mentioned your day job when you were writing this.
Are you playing the role of therapist, Ashley? I mean, come on.
That's why we poured you a martini.
I was going to say the martini has already started to be consumed
exactly.
here.
Well, you had a
Put me on the
very
couch.
distinguished career at National Catholic Reporter, part of which was a Vatican reporter in Rome. So give us a day in the life of a Vatican reporter. How do you get Cardinals to talk to you?
Well, I think anyone that covers the Catholic Church, it really is in a privileged position. You understand this as well. We get to meet interesting people. We get to find out about their life, what motivates them. We get to ask questions. We get to go to events. And I always said, I get to read and write and talk to people for a living. And I mean, who can argue about that? It's sort of like the life of a student. And you often get to do it in good restaurants.
That people actually read what you're writing.
Yeah, that's the hope, at least. So I moved to Rome in June, the end of June of 2021, exactly 4 years ago, to become the National Catholic Reporter's Vatican correspondent. And I'd already been to Rome quite a bit when I was at Crux as their U.S. correspondent. I'd covered a number of synods, already done a papal trip, and so I understood how the place worked. But really, so much of the beat is personality-driven, and so you just have to spend a lot of time having coffees, meals, trying to talk to as many people as you can to sort of understand what their office is, what role they play in this sort of bureaucratic system known as the Roman Curia. And then get to sort of see sort of what motivates them. And sort of I treated it as a political beat to sort of cover the Vatican like the New York Times covers the White House. Obviously, I'm Catholic. The National Catholic Reporter is a Catholic publication, although some have certainly argued over that over the years. But no, I think it's important to talk to as many people as you can to sort of see, what is motivating the people and the place to best understand the both political and spiritual currents.
And we've heard that the Curia, the different departments are sometimes competing with each other. There is politicking behind the scenes. How much of there is that? Is our impression of it as this kind of dark place true?
Well, I think to compete with something, you have to be aware of its existence.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's this strange thing because you've spent a lot of time in Rome, especially over the last few years. And one of the things you notice is that the Vatican is a very small place, and so you're running into people all the time. And so I was always amazed when I go to one restaurant and be with a curial official, and they're doing the same thing I'm doing, taking stock of the room to figure out who's dining with whom, who's talking to whom. And, it's interesting. It doesn't mean that battle lines are being drawn necessarily, but people want to get information. I mean, come on. It's journalists and Vatican officials in that sense are very similar.
And you're coming up on, you had planned to transition to your new role.
Yes, the conclave didn't make me quit my job.
No. But I mean, what an exclamation point.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
What did you ask God for, like a final shebang on your way out?
Quite the opposite. I mean, Pope Francis died, as we all know, on Easter Monday, at which point I had exactly 6 weeks left on the job. And I was...
You were ready to coast.
I had my list planned of all the people I was going to have farewell lunches with, all the beaches that I wanted to hit up on the weekends, all the parties I wanted to throw myself, and all of that got thrown out the window because I realized the last 6 weeks of my time at the National Catholic Reporter as their Vatican correspondent were going to be the busiest 6 weeks of my life. And it was all just as awful as I prepared. But now on the other side of it...
It's the sound of 1,000 tiny violins.
Exactly. On the other side of it, I'm very grateful.
Yeah, because as far as Conclave goes, this is a pretty exciting one. I don't think many people were going into it expecting an American pope, but we'll get to whether you saw that coming. But before we got to that, you start your book out with this claim that this was the most important conclave in, I believe, 60 years, so since the election of Paul VI. Make the case for why that's the case.
Sure. So the historical parallel I point to is when Pope Paul VI was elected after Pope John the 23rd. Pope John the 23rd had, of course, initiated the Second Vatican Council, which was in 1962. And it was this time where there was so much hope for possible reform in the life of the church. And there was also this sense of uncertainty. And so that conclave in that elected Paul VI was really a referendum on what John the 23rd had started. And so I try to make a comparison to the conclave of 2025, where I do believe it was a referendum on Pope Francis and the reforms that he initiated as Pope, and particularly his large project of synodality, which of course is this years-long global listening process throughout the world in the Catholic Church to sort of reconsider how the church's structures might become more participatory, more welcoming, more inclusive. And that, of course, excited so many Catholics. But as we all know, it also made a lot of people anxious and nervous and stoked fears. And the Cardinals had to decide for themselves in this conclave, is this the path we want to continue on? And I think that in electing Cardinal Prevost as Pope Leo XIV, they certainly chose to follow in that path of reform, but they chose someone who would do so in a very deliberate, cautious, probably more organized manner than Pope Francis.
Take me back to the moment of white smoke, because we were there. I wasn't expecting it. I was cheering for a baby seagull that had landed next to the chimney just moments before. But white smoke comes out, and I'm thinking it has to be one of the front runners. If it's been this quick, it's got to be either Cardinal Parolin or Cardinal Tagle. What's going through your mind at that time?
It was crazy. I was standing on the rooftop of the Augustinianum, one of the religious houses overlooking the Vatican. I was on set with NBC News at the time, and I was really, like you, focused on that seagull, and I was staring at the screen, trying to capture the perfect photo of that seagull in the chimney when you saw the smoke come out. And you realized it wasn't like past conclaves where there was this long period, is it white, is it black? It was pretty evidently white straight away. And I thought, I think this is Cardinal Prevost. I had already convinced myself in the days leading up to the election that Cardinal Parolin, who was Pope Francis' Secretary of State and is currently Pope Leo's Secretary of State, that he would have trouble reaching the 2/3 majority necessary to be elected Pope. And I thought the Cardinals were really interested in a pastor, and Cardinal Parolin is a very talented diplomat, but he has no pastoral experience. And so I just never really thought it would be him. And so the fact that it was so early on, I thought it has to be someone that could quickly pull together a coalition. And I had made the case in the days leading up to that, that Cardinal Prevost was one of the candidates well-positioned that could bring together a geographic, a geographic, theological, ideological sort of coalition to be elected Pope fairly quickly, and he was. So.
And in your previous job, you talk about trying to talk to as many people as you can. Yeah. Did you ever share a coffee or a martini with Cardinal Prevost?
Yes, I was very fortunate that when he arrived in Rome, Pope Francis brought him to Rome in 2023 to head the Vatican's office that advises the Pope on a lot of bishops' appointments around the world. And so I had asked him for an interview, and he declined the interview because of the fact that, the nature of that office is pretty sensitive when you're vetting possible candidates to become bishops. But he said, we can have a chat. And so we had a very warm hour-long conversation in his office, and that was the first time I met him, and then would meet with him on many occasions over the last few years, both at official events, receptions, gatherings, dinner. So I'm very fortunate to have gotten to know him and get a sense of who he is. He's not someone that, there are certain cardinals that you often see sort of always making headlines, always doing events, conferences. He's not that sort of person. He's a sort of quiet, discreet figure, but he's very warm, and so he was someone that would always happily talk.
No, I think it says something that, he declined the interview, but was willing to meet with you.
Yeah. I think it was, one of the things I talk about in this book is that he's someone who is quite studious, and he's committed, I think, to a style of leadership that is motivated by a desire to listen. And I think part of the thing that he did that day when we first met was he had questions for me as well. He was doing his own homework. I was doing my own homework. And that's the nature of both of our jobs.
Yeah, I was thinking he's this guy who had this meteoric rise, kind of like from missionary to, a provincial head, but in the Augustinian world. And then Pope Francis makes him a bishop, and then he brings him to Rome and in charge of this really important curial office, then makes him a cardinal. And I imagine he might feel like a fish out of water. So when you met with him, did you get the sense that he was trying to learn the ropes and understand how this, crazy Vatican bureaucracy works? Or was he someone who, because of his time in Rome as head of the Augustinians, felt pretty comfortable in that role?
I think he was someone who knew how the Vatican worked as an outsider, because he had spent basically a third of his life in Rome, in school, and then as the head of the Augustinian order. And his job in that capacity was sort of to represent the order to the Vatican. So now he's sort of changed, coming to Rome, he had changed locations, changed positions. He was a big part of the central bureaucracy of the church. So I think he was trying to sort of figure out, what his place was in that, how things operated. He certainly struck me as someone who had never really done much forward-facing work with the media. And he told me as much. And I think you can even see that in the press conferences when he appeared during the synod. He's someone that is not someone that is naturally at ease on the dais, because he's an academic, he's a canon lawyer, he's cautious. He wants to think through his words, and we spout things off and, and speak freely and apologize later. And that's not his style. So I think, just his very nature is someone he'd much rather be on the sort of receiving end of things, collecting information, observing, taking note quietly, including on how the Vatican works.
One thing I've noticed is that he has sort of nailed the parish priest sense of humor.
Yes.
Which, when you get up, he gets up to give the homily and he opens with a self-effacing joke or something like that. And it doesn't make you crack up, but it just makes you kind of chortle.
It's the sort of thing that you smile and you kind of, chuckle, but you're not, rolling over on the floor laughing because, I don't think that's who he is. I think he enjoys a laugh, but it's a laugh just to sort of lighten the mood, not necessarily for the sake of humor itself.
Right. And I think, his style of papacy is sort of, if we, finish that thought, is going to be very different than his predecessor, Pope Francis, right?
And I think that will be a shock to the system. I know it is for a lot of our colleagues in the media to go from this figure, who became such a media darling. I mean, by the end of Francis's first year, he was on the cover of Time magazine as the Person of the Year. He became the most important story in the world. And even though Robert Prevost is an American, Pope Leo XIV, the first ever American pope, he may not be the most important story at the end of this year. Obviously, when you're competing against Trump, that's a very difficult thing to do all the time. But I don't think he is someone who is going. I think he'll use the media spotlight, the bully pulpit, when he feels it's necessary. But I think he's going to do he's going to spend a lot of time focusing on the inner workings of the church, because I think he sees that Francis started a lot of things and a lot of processes, but he's got to fine tune them. And I think he's far more interested in that, and that suits his personality better as well.
What do we know about the relationship between then Cardinal Prevost and Pope Francis? Because there are these vague references to some fight they had back when he was.
Does anyone know what that was about?
Yeah, so Cardinal Prevost has been very open about this. When he was a cardinal, he talked on several occasions about how when he was the head of the Augustinians, that's when he first met then Cardinal Bergoglio, the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, who of course would become Pope Francis. And they had what he has described as a clash over a personnel matter. So presumably an Augustinian priest and a potential assignment. Now, the fact that they clashed over that weighed heavily on Cardinal Prevost, and he really thought it would sort of poison the well. And when Pope Francis was elected in 2013, he thought, oh, this guy's going to hold that against me. And in fact, the opposite happened when they met for the first time after his election. The Pope reminded him that he had actually helped him out on another matter. And so what Francis remembered was the support that he had given him, whereas what Prevost remembered was the fact that they had kind of, clashed at one point. And so I think it's interesting that, they had this, or Prevost certainly had this fear that there might be a setback, but it proved opposite.
Well, I kind of got the sense that Prevost saw that as a good thing, oh, phew, I'm not going to be made a bishop.
Yeah, of course. He said, look, my life is going to get a lot easier. I'm not going to be someone that they're scrutinizing, because he had been in leadership, and so which the natural sort of path might be to consider whether this guy should become a bishop. And he thought, I'm safe. I can go back to just sort of parish ministry.
In the book, you subtly make the case that not that Francis was sort of picking Prevost as a successor, but he does set him up for success in a short period of time.
Absolutely. I mean, he set this guy up to head the Vatican office that was going to expose him to cardinals and bishops from all over the world on a regular basis. When Pope Francis first brought him to Rome in 2023, and soon thereafter made him a cardinal. And when he announced the names of the new cardinals in that batch, he named him first. And whoever the Pope names first when he announces new cardinals is a real honorific, and that person is chosen to speak on behalf of the other cardinals at the ceremony when they're made cardinals. So it puts a further spotlight on him. And then the Pope promoted him to the highest rank among the cardinals. So it's quite clear that Pope Francis trusted Prevost a lot. Before he even came to Rome, Prevost would often meet Pope Francis for a private lunch, just the two of them in the Pope's personal quarters. And I think because of the fact that they both had this great knowledge and love of Latin America, that provided a foundation for them to really see eye to eye.
He was only head of the dicastery for bishops for a short time.
Yeah, 2 years,
2
basically.
years. Is there anything from that time in terms of the bishops that were appointed or decisions that were made that can give us a hint to what he might do as Pope?
If you look at our own country here in the United States, Pope Francis hasn't made too many real legacy appointments. And when I say legacy appointments, meaning the idea that you picking someone quite young, like in their 50s, where they're going to lead a diocese, a big diocese for 25 years. So Pope Francis has not done that. But I'd say certainly in recent years, the most prominent pick of Pope Francis was Cardinal McElroy going to Washington, D.C. That would have been something that then Bishop Cardinal Prevost would have been intimately involved in those discussions. And the fact that that happened under his watch is probably a sign of something that he supported.
What do you make of sort of the rush to sort of assign Pope Leo to one camp or another, or the rush to claim Leo based on, I don't know, it feels like at this point people are kind of reading tea leaves or looking at what clothes he's wearing or what words he uses. Have you seen anything that is indicative that oh, Pope Leo's definitely going to bring back the Latin Mass, or Pope Leo's definitely going to allow women deacons.
Well, I think it's perfectly normal. I mean, part of what I did in this book is to offer an interpretive key to try to understand who he is and what this election means. But I think you have to, let Leo be Leo. These are early days, as we've discussed. And, I think he himself is figuring out the job. And there are some questions I suspect that he doesn't have real opinions on yet. I don't know that he's spent a lot of time thinking about what LGBTQ ministry should look like in the Catholic Church. I think he has thought probably a lot about Latin Mass because of the fact that, one of the things that in restricting the Latin Mass that Pope Francis did was he, basically set up, a conflict for those that didn't adhere to that. The Vatican's Office for Worship had to deal with, but also a lot of people forget this, the Vatican's Department for Bishops, because they were certainly responsible for enforcing, or in some cases not enforcing, the new restrictions. And I know that he was quite helpful in the sort of problematic cases where bishops didn't want to follow Pope Francis's lead. So I think that's something that he has thought about, but he probably wants to think through, how do I reach out to those who feel perhaps marginalized or excluded because of this, and what is my own take going to be in reaching them? And I don't think we have answers to that, and it may be some time before we do.
This is a much more minor decision, but he did have to decide whether he was going to wear the red mozzetta when he came out onto the balcony. And
did he, though? Did he have to decide? I mean, was it a statement?
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Like, on the one
just...
hand, it's just something to wear, and every other pope besides Pope Francis has done it. But on the other hand, people were watching, and if he had stuck with the plain white, it would have been read a certain way, and it was a different outcome.
I'm not of any particular opinion on that. I think he perhaps made the conscious decision to put it on, or the Vatican operates on rubrics, and what is the rubrics? He was handed things to wear. The thing that he seemed most focused on, not so much was appearance, in my view, was on what he wanted to say, and the fact that he had handwritten that speech.
In such a short time.
With such a distilled message, I think that's where his mind was. And I think we can say that if he wanted to wear the mozzetta as an olive branch to reach out to people, that is certainly congruous with what he did in that speech, which is to say he wants a church open for all. And I think those aren't in conflict.
Do you see anything with him deciding to move back into the Apostolic Palace?
I know that during the pre-conclave meetings that multiple cardinals told me that they were surprised how much that was discussed. Not so much as a statement about who the Pope is in the office, but for purely financial matters. The Vatican is, in the red financially, and it would be a far easier thing on the Vatican's budget to only have to provide security at the Apostolic Palace to the tune of millions. And at a time when the Vatican is in need of millions, this is a very easy thing the Pope could do to basically help the budget out.
So the more humble thing to do, actually,
is to move back into the Apostolic Palace.
I just feel like they need a different word than palace. It is a palace.
Yes. Yeah. But it's not palatial. I mean, the place is nothing over the top. I mean, as someone who's looking for a very tiny apartment in Manhattan right now, it would be a palace for me, but yes.
Going back to what you heard from Cardinals, what was most discussed in those pre-conclave meetings, you mentioned the budget problems the Vatican's having. Do you know if they talked about or him being an American who had some business sense was a big factor in why he was so palatable to people?
No, not. I don't think they linked the fact that he was an American with having business sense. Okay. I mean, we have a president of the United States who's a businessman who's gone bankrupt. So I don't think that those two necessarily go hand in hand. They saw him as a problem solver, and in having a problem solver who has that sort of can-do, practical attitude to challenges, they, I think, saw this as someone who can fix some real bureaucratic issues that we're facing.
Everyone has these little anecdotes that are getting reported over and over again, like, oh, he always played priest when he was a kid, and or he is a missionary in Peru. Is there anything in your research that's sort of been under-focused on that is revelatory about who Leo is going to be?
Well, I really want to know how he does on Wordle. We know he plays the New York Times Wordle every day.
I know. Does he use the same starter word every day?
Exactly. That's the research that I'm most interested in. No, in terms of revelatory, no. I think this is a guy who is predictable, and that's part of the reason why he was elected Pope. I don't think there are going to be big surprises. They wanted someone following a Pope who was a disruptor, who was an outsider, who was a bit of a maverick, to continue on the reforms that Francis initiated, but to become someone who could actually do this in a systematic way for a church of 1.3, 1.4 billion Catholics, to figure out how we can do this. And so that's why they chose someone who was a manager, who shares the vision but is a manager and can get it done. So I don't think there are huge revelations. I wrote this book in a very short period of time. There will be people that go over the coming months, years, to Chicago, to Peru, to uncover every story they can find about him. And we are going to learn a lot about him, but I don't think it's going to change the perception of who he is. With Bergoglio, there's this period in his life when he was in exile, where everyone still sort of tried to say, what really happened in his life in this period? Leo, Cardinal Prevost's life is pretty well documented. It follows a pretty standard course. And it's an all-American story.
Something I've been thinking about is how young he is.
Yeah. He could be Pope for a very long time.
He could be Pope for a very long time. But also, we haven't seen a young Pope, certainly in my lifetime. Not since John Paul II turned 75.
Not since Jude Law.
Yeah, right, of course. No, not since the young Pope. But we haven't had a Pope under 75 since John Paul II turned 75. And I think that's kind of fascinating for a number of reasons. One, his sort of stamina for the job. Not that Francis was schlepping, but age wore on him, I think, in his later years. But also his relationship with technology, I think, is fascinating. We know that he had a personal Twitter account, for example, had tweeted out articles from both of our respective publications. I don't know. I don't think we're quite ready for that. And I don't even know that the Cardinals had considered, something what like a digital paper trail might mean. What does it mean to have a Pope for, 25 years maybe? That's a very long time. When
technology is changing a lot faster than it was in previous.
On the other hand, I'm thrilled that if we're going to have someone tackling artificial intelligence, there's a decent shot that Pope Leo has actually seen what ChatGPT is and what it does. I never got this. Pope Francis would speak about AI. I never really believed that he had used it.
Of course not. Yes.
Right? He
didn't have a smartphone.
He didn't have a television. Yeah. I think he's going to relate to the world in a different way than Francis did. Francis related because of his gestures, because of his humility, because of these like sort of viral moments. But Leo's going to have, I think, more life experiences that are going to connect with a lot more people, if only because he's American and we export so much culture.
Yeah, and, you will have, or we have in Leo, a Pope who is reading the American press every day.
Yeah.
I mean, how crazy is that? And, of course, in technology, one of the things that I knew about him even before he became the Pope was that he was interested in questions about AI and had been asking people what he should be reading to actually better understand it. So I think it gives you the sense that he's someone who had a real sense of what was happening in the world around him, and he was engaged. We've joked about him playing Wordle, but the fact that he was playing a New York Times games app every day is wild. And I think because of that, and we'll see over the next 2 decades or however long he lives, how much he stays in touch with that. But I think he's been asking himself these questions, and now he's going to continue asking them, and he'll do so as the successor of Peter.
You mentioned that we shouldn't expect that many surprises from Pope Leo's biography, but that doesn't mean he can't surprise us going forward. When people elected Pope Francis, they did not expect what they were getting at all. But it took a few months, maybe 6 months with Francis for people to be like, oh, what? So what should we be looking for with Pope Leo going forward in terms of are there big decisions coming down the pipeline that will indicate where he might be going?
Yeah, so I would say with Francis, one of the ways the world got to know him early on was through gestures. And Leo is acting through gestures already. I mean, we've seen him, he's taking very seriously his role as Bishop of Rome, leading public processions, spending time getting to know the local church in Rome. But I think I'd point to sort of two major things to look for. One, what he does concretely on the Synod and its next steps. The Synod, of course, being Pope Francis's great legacy and reform initiative. These Synod study groups that were sort of convoked by Francis in order to sort of study some of the more sensitive questions. They're sort of resuming their meetings happening at the Vatican. So they'll get to talk to Pope Leo for the first time about what happens next. And so when he makes some decisions on that and what happens concretely with the Synod, we'll get a sense of how that's going to play out. The other thing is travel. We know his first trip will almost certainly be the trip to Nicaea later this year to mark the 1700 years since the Council of Nicaea. It will be a great ecumenical moment. We've already seen serious signs from Leo that he really wants, visible unity among the Christian churches. But after that, what does he prioritize in terms of international travel? We know he likes to travel.
And does he give a press conference on the flight back to Rome?
Absolutely. Yeah. Both the most exciting and terrifying part of traveling with Pope Francis was always those press conferences. But his travel will tell us a lot about what he wants to prioritize. And then once he starts naming his own team in the Vatican, I think
how long does it usually take for them to replace the top people at the curia?
I think with Francis, his first big appointment was Cardinal Parolin as Secretary of State. I believe it came roughly 8 months into the job. So I think, we're at the beginning of summer. We know Leo is going to spend some time taking a bit of a holiday. He's had a busy few months. He's earned it. And I think he'll start thinking about this then. But these are early days.
Yeah, I feel like he will be defined in opposition is the wrong word, but in contrast to Francis for probably the first year or two.
Yes.
And then it sort of, does he continue Francis's reforms? Does he keep Francis's people in place? And eventually you start to stake out your own ground as a pope. And you mentioned it took Francis 8 months to name his first major curial appointment.
Yeah, and Francis was slow. I mean, it took Francis really almost 10 years into his papacy to have his full government in place. I mean, it took him a while to name his own team.
So,
including, I'd say, one of his most significant appointments was Leo, Cardinal Prevost, as the head of the Vatican's dicastery for bishops. He left Cardinal Ouellet in that office for almost a decade. So, it takes time for popes to make these decisions. Francis did not have the gift of time. He was already much older than Leo when he was elected. Leo could go at a bit more cautious pace.
You're wrapping up your time as a Vatican correspondent. How did being so close to sort of where the sausage is made impact your faith as a Catholic?
Look, there's this saying that we've all heard that why is there so much faith to be found in Rome? Because everyone that goes there loses it.
I had not heard that.
And for some people, that's true. I mean, I think, as I said at the beginning, one thing that I never took for granted was the fact that this job gets you real access, and access gives you insight. And for the most part, I met people working in very outdated structures that, if I were Pope, and I would never be elected Pope, I would probably have more of a burn it all down mindset. But they're doing...
Same. You and I are the same in that regard.
Yeah. Light the place on fire. But they're doing so out of love of the institution and love of church. And that is far easier to see than it is to not see.
All right, Chris, thank you so much for your insights. Before we let you go, we have one last question that we ask all of our guests. Yes. And that is, if you could canonize one person, living or dead, Catholic or not, fictional or real, who would it be and why?
I was thinking about this on the subway here because last time I canonized Stephen Sondheim, which is an unconventional choice, but now he's gone to God, and I think he is worthy of being a saint. But I am going to canonize someone much more ecclesial this time, and it is going to be Natalie Beccar. Sister Natalie Beccar, because we're just talking in this conversation about what it's like to work within a very complicated system, and I think she has done so exceptionally. She is a French nun who Pope Francis named in 2021 to be a secretary at the Vatican Synod Office, and I think she's been a tremendous global ambassador for the reforms of synodality, really trying to listen to as many people, both sort of real cheerleaders of the process and real critics of the process. And she's done so as a woman in a place that is very difficult to work as a woman. And she's done so as a non-Italian in a system that prioritizes Italians. And she's done so with great grace and aplomb. And yes, I would canonize Natalie Baccar.
And, one of the things during a papal transition is that some people who work in the Vatican are like, will I have a job under the new guy? I was chatting with someone who is a Vatican official who was like, who knows what my life's going to be like.
Absolutely. A regime change.
Yep. And you write about that in Sister Natalie's case in your book, but she kind of has a funny ending to the night of Pope Leo's election.
Yeah, I think Sister Natalie was so invested in the reforms that Pope Francis initiated. He had called her to Rome to serve in this role. And you could just tell in the days after his death that she was affected on a personal level. And there was just great anxiety about what would come of this great legacy that Francis started. And she goes home on the night after the conclave that elected Leo. And who does she find there but her next door neighbor, who's now the Pope, coming back home to his apartment. And so they had this really sweet interaction that I write about in the book. And you could tell that she was just overjoyed with his election and what it meant for what she perceives to mean for the church. And she shared that joy with the world that night online. And I think it is something that's palpable.
All right. That is Sister Natalie Baccar.
You mean Saint?
Saint.
Yeah, yes.
Natalie Baccar,
I'm not rooting for her early demise. So.
Chris, congratulations on the book. One more time for the audience. It is Pope Leo XIV, Inside the Conclave and the Dawn of a New Papacy, and it is out from Loyola Press. You should buy it. It's amazing. It's a Herculean effort to publish a book in 10 days. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you both.
It
was
welcome
great,
back
friends.
to New York.
Yes,
Yeah,
it was always
so
great
good
to
to
have
see
you
you.
both in Rome. But now we can have more overpriced cocktails here in New York rather than Rome.
And you can
right.
actually drink yours.
Yes,
Since you had to
now I
talk
can
the
have
whole
mine.
time.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Zac. Thank you, Ashley.